The first light slid over Tescan Vale, turning red dust into copper. Adrian Pike was collecting eggs when he caught movement beneath the low roof. He stopped, gripping his worn carpenter's axe. "Don't move," he said. From the shadows stepped a woman. Black tangled hair, obsidian eyes, 2 eggs pressed to her palms. The morning air over Tescan Vale carried the smell of dry earth and cedar smoke. Adrian Pike moved slowly between the coop and the cabin, his boots crunching over gravel still cold from the night. He was a man of routine. Wake before dawn, collect the eggs, light the stove, speak to no one. That last part had never been difficult. Nobody came this far to the edge of the iron frontier unless they were running from something. He was on his 4th egg when the straw shifted. Adrian went still. His hand moved to the worn handle of his carpenter's axe without thinking, muscle memory from a life he'd tried to bury. He turned slowly, scanning the low shadow beneath the coop's rear wall. 2 eyes caught the early light, dark and wide, watching him the way an animal watches before it decides whether to flee or fight. "Don't move," he said. His voice came out calm, flat, like a stone dropped into still water. She didn't run. That surprised him. She stepped out from the shadows, and Adrian took her in with the practiced eye of a man who had spent years reading people in firelit camps and blood-soaked fields. Tall, even hunched, skin the vivid green of deep summer leaves. Her hair was a black tangle, threaded through with a cord of bone beads. Her jaw was set hard, and her eyes, dark as obsidian chips, didn't waver from his face. She wore a leather skirt stitched with crude patterns, and around her wrist a small crystal on a sinew string caught the morning light. One of the eggs in her palms had cracked. The yolk ran between her fingers. She didn't look at it. She kept looking at him. "I only need 2, she said. The words came out slow, dragged through a guttural accent that rolled the vowels like gravel in a stream. "For the morning meal, for my small ones." Adrian's jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the gap between the boards at the rear of the coop. 2 faces peered back at him through the dark slit of the opening, small, green, wide-eyed. A boy and a girl, pressed together in the shadow, absolutely silent. The axe handle was still in his grip. He stood there for a long moment. The wind moved through the cedar trees behind the cabin, slow and indifferent. A crow called once from somewhere far up the valley slope. The sun kept climbing. He thought about what he should do. He thought about the eggs. He thought about the faces in the gap. Then he thought about a winter, years ago, when he had eaten stolen bread on the floor of a burning farmhouse and called it survival. He let go of the axe handle. "You broke one," he said. She glanced down at the cracked egg dripping through her fingers. Her jaw tightened for a moment, then released. She looked back up. "Yes. So, now you owe me." Her chin lifted slightly. She didn't argue. Adrian turned toward the cabin without another word. He stopped at the door and looked back over his shoulder. "There's bread on the stove. Bring them inside." She didn't move immediately. He could feel her weighing it, calculating. He understood that instinct perfectly. Trust was a currency that got spent fast in places like this. "I'm not going to hurt them," he said. It came out rougher than he intended. A long pause. Then she turned to the coop and spoke low words in her own tongue. The 2 children slipped out through the gap, blinking in the morning light. The boy was thin and bright-eyed. The girl held her brother's hand and stared at Adrian with a gaze too serious for her age. Adrian held the door open. He didn't know why. The reason, if there was one, stayed where reasons usually stayed in him, out of reach. He went inside to put more bread on the board. As he did, he caught a glint along the river's edge below the valley. A sharp flash of light, there and gone, with no cloud moving overhead and no bird in the water. He paused at the window for a moment, then turned back to the stove. He filed it away the way he filed most things he couldn't explain, in the back of his mind, where old instincts lived. Adrian Pike had not always been a carpenter. There was a version of him that most people in Goldport had heard about in scattered pieces. A mercenary out of the Northern Marks, one of the Iron Frontier's licensed hunters who worked the Ridge campaigns for silver coin and the Crown's approval. The scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw was the most visible leftover from those years, a line drawn by a blade in the dark during a raid that he still sometimes saw when he closed his eyes. He was 38 now, and lived like a man who had decided the world owed him silence. He had left the campaigns after a winter that he never talked about, not because he was proud of what happened, but because he was ashamed of what he had allowed to happen. He had followed orders, he had not asked questions, and when the smoke cleared over a frozen hillside and he saw what the orders had produced, something inside him had broken cleanly and never quite set right again. He built the cabin with his own hands, chose the edge of Tescan Vale because it was far from banners and farther from the kind of men who carried them. He cut wood, traded repairs for flour and salt, and asked nothing of anyone. Under his bunk sat a flat wooden box, sealed and unlit, that he had not opened in 3 years. He did not think about it often, he preferred not to. Now there was a woman at his table, Crevena. She had given her name without ceremony, pulling the 2 children onto the bench beside her and tearing the bread into careful pieces. She gave each child the larger portions and took the smallest for herself. He noticed that. He noticed the way her hands moved, deliberate and practiced, always protecting the smaller bodies around her. The boy was Tyon, 7, maybe 8. He ate fast and kept looking at Adrian with curious, unafraid eyes that seemed to take in everything and store it for later. The girl was Noah, younger, quieter. She ate slowly and stayed close to her mother's arm. Adrian sat across the table and drank his coffee and said nothing. Crevena was the one who broke the silence. "You were a soldier," she said. It wasn't a question. "Was," he agreed. "Iron Frontier, Northern Marks campaign." She said it the same way she might name the weather. Flat and certain. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You know those campaigns. My husband was killed in one." She said it without drama, pulling her bread apart. 3 seasons ago, Ridge of Colvar, soldiers with frontier badges. The cabin went very quiet. Adrian set his cup down. He didn't say sorry. He didn't think she wanted that. And he wasn't sure he deserved to be the one offering it. He had worn that badge. He had ridden those ridges. "Is that why you came this far south?" he asked. "I came because north is ash," she said simply. "The clans are scattered. There is no camp left that will take in a widow with 2 mouths and no fighting strength to offer." She paused, turning her bread over in her hands. "Part of my clan, maybe 20 people, moved to the southern hills before the last campaign. I don't know if they made it far enough south. I tell myself they did." Noah leaned against her mother's arm. Crevena's hand moved automatically to cover the child's, protective as a clam closing over soft flesh. Adrian looked at his table, the rough-cut boards he had planed and fitted with his own tools, the clay cups, the iron stove, the single window looking out at the cedar ridge. He had built this place to be empty. He had been very good at keeping it that way. "You can sleep in the storage shed tonight," he said at last. "It's dry. I'll put a board across the draft gap." Crevena looked at him for a long moment. Her obsidian eyes gave nothing away, but something in the set of her shoulders eased, barely, like a rope given 1/2 turn of slack. "What do you want in return?" she asked. "There's a garden plot behind the cabin," he said. "I've never been able to grow anything in it. Ground's too hard. I keep breaking handles on it." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The storage shed was smaller than a horse stall, but Adrian had cleared it out the same evening, and laid down a folded canvas over the boards. He found 2 wool blankets in the chest under his bed, smelling of cedar and long storage, and left them outside the shed door without knocking. In the morning, the blankets had been folded and placed back on the step. He understood it immediately. She wasn't the kind of woman who accepted charity she hadn't earned yet. He picked them up, carried them back inside without a word, and left the shed door open so she could take them if she chose to, on her own terms. He didn't mention it again. He also found a bundle of dried herbs tied with sinew hanging from the shed door frame, small waxy leaves he didn't recognize, arranged with a care that suggested they meant something. He left them where they were. Carpenter came to find him at the woodpile before the sun had cleared the ridge. She was already dressed, leather skirt and a patched hide vest, the bone bead cord wound twice around her wrist. Noah and Tyon trailed behind her, the boy carrying a small clay cup that he offered to Adrian with both hands and a serious expression. Inside the cup was some kind of grain porridge, thick and warm, sweetened with something dark. Adrian stared at it. "It is not poison," Carpenter said. She said it the way people say things they have had to say before. "Tyon made it, with what I found in your pantry. If there is a rule against it, tell me." Adrian took the cup. He drank it standing at the woodpile. It was good. He didn't say so. "There's no rule," he said. After breakfast, such as it was, he took them to the garden plot behind the cabin. It was a sorry piece of ground. He'd tried twice to break it for planting and given up both times. The soil was red and cracked, dense with clay, and threaded through with the roots of an old thornwood that had died years back but refused to fully surrender. Carpenter crouched down and pressed both palms flat against the surface. She stayed that way for a moment, eyes half closed, reading something he couldn't see. Then she stood and asked him for the mattock. She worked the ground in a way Adrian had never seen, not chopping at it but pressing and rolling, breaking the crust in patient layers, coaxing the clay apart rather than forcing it. She hummed while she worked, very low, more vibration than melody. After an hour, the ground had opened up in a way that 2 days of his own labor had never achieved. He watched from the cabin steps, coffee going cold in his hand. The children worked alongside her, Tyon crumbling the broken clods, Noah collecting stones and stacking them along the edge of the plot in a careful line. They worked together with the quiet ease of people who had always worked together, no instructions needed, each knowing their part. Adrian went back inside and started mixing mortar for a repair job on the chimney stack. By noon, Carpenter appeared at the cabin door. Her arms were dusty to the elbow. "The ground is ready," she said. "You'll need seed. Turnip root does well in that soil, possibly black bean." He looked up from his work. "You can tell that from one morning?" "My grandmother planted on ground worse than that," she said. "She fed 30 people from it." He believed her. "I'll go to Goldport for seed before the week's out," he said. "There's more bread in the cloth on the shelf. Take what you need." She looked at the shelf, then back at him. "You are a strange man, Adrian Pike." "I've been told," he said, and went back to his mortar. That evening, sitting outside near the fire circle while the children slept inside, Carpenter asked him why he had not turned them away. He thought about it for a while before answering. "I'm not sure," he said finally. "Maybe I'm tired of all the quiet." She said nothing to that, but she stayed by the fire a while longer before going in. The days began to take on a shape. Adrian worked his carpentry, taking jobs where he could get them, a wagon axle for a rancher 3 miles up the valley, a new door frame for the widow Hess at the edge of Thornwood. He worked fast and well and charged little, which kept him fed if not comfortable. Carpenter worked the garden. She had a method he couldn't fully follow, mixing ash and something crushed from a small pouch of dried material she kept in her pack, pressing it into the turned earth at intervals only she seemed to understand. By the fourth day, the cracked red surface had softened into something dark and receptive, and when the seed went in, it went in easily. Tyon followed Adrian like a shadow, not aggressively, not asking for attention, just present. The boy would appear at the edge of whatever Adrian was doing and watch with that same quiet intensity, absorbing everything. One afternoon, while Adrian was planing a board, Tyon picked up a small offcut and turned it over in his hands, studying the grain with a focused expression that was oddly familiar. Adrian handed him a small smoothing block without comment. Tyon ran it along the wood. Got the angle wrong at first, then corrected himself. Ran it again. His face opened with a satisfaction so pure it was almost uncomfortable to look at. Adrian turned back to his own work. After dinner that evening, while Crevena was mending a strap on her pack by firelight, she looked up and spoke. "He's never had a man show him a trade," she said. "His father was a hunter, and then he was not." Adrian kept his eyes on the board he was marking. "I haven't shown him anything." "You handed him the block," she said, and went back to her mending. He didn't respond to that. But the next morning, before starting his work, he set out a second plane and a handful of small off-cut boards on the bench near the door. He didn't say anything about it. When Tyon appeared at mid-morning, he found them there and understood immediately. Noah, meanwhile, had claimed a patch of ground near the water barrel as her own. She had arranged a row of small stones there, each one selected with apparent care, and spent long intervals crouching over them in a way that reminded Adrian of the way Crevena had read the soil. The girl was building something. He didn't know what. He didn't ask. The evenings were getting easier. Adrian had lived alone long enough to have forgotten how houses sounded when they were occupied. The small sounds, footsteps on boards, the low conversation of a woman speaking to her children in another tongue, the occasional clatter of a cup, all of it had been noise to him at first. By the end of the first week, he had stopped registering it as intrusion. He was not sure when it had become something else. One night, he lay awake and listened to the cedar trees moving in the wind and thought about the glint he had seen along the river on that first morning, the one with no source. He hadn't seen it since, but it sat in the back of his thoughts, patient as an old wound. He told himself it was nothing. He almost believed it. A month had passed since that first morning. Tyon chased a grasshopper across the garden plot and fell in the irrigation furrow and laughed so hard he couldn't get himself back up. Adrian heard the sound from inside the cabin and stood still with a cup halfway to his mouth. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard a child laugh. Not here in the Vale, not really. The sound was bright and ridiculous and impossible to be unmoved by. He set the cup down and went to the window and watched the boy rolling in the dirt, still laughing, while Crevena tried to pull him upright and eventually gave up and sat down in the furrow beside him. She wasn't laughing, but there was something in her face, soft and complicated, the expression people make when something has hurt them for so long that joy feels strange and necessary all at once. He went back to his bench and picked up his tool. He was smiling, briefly, without quite meaning to. He turned his face toward the window, so the expression had somewhere to go. That night, after Noah and Tyon had been settled on their canvas pallets in the storage shed, Crevena sat near the fire outside the cabin. Adrian brought 2 cups of chicory brew out and set one near her without ceremony and sat in his usual chair. She began to hum, low and continuous, the sound rolling up from her chest like the vibration of a plucked wire. It was the same melody he had caught pieces of before, but longer now, more complete. He listened without comment. When she finished, he asked, "What is that?" "A travelling song," she said. "My grandmother sang it when the clan moved to new ground. It says the wind chose to stay when everything else left." He turned that over in his mind. Optimistic for a travel song. "My people are not afraid of movement," she said. "Only of stillness for the wrong reasons." They sat in silence for a while. The fire cracked and popped. Somewhere up the valley, something moved through the underbrush, heavy and unhurried. "Do you miss them?" he asked. "The clan." She took a long moment. "Every morning," she said. "I wake and listen for sounds I won't hear." She looked at the fire. "The ones who moved south, I hope they went far enough. I tell myself they did." She paused. "It is easier than the other thought." He didn't push further, neither did she. Later, lying on his bunk in the dark, Adrien stared at the ceiling and found himself thinking that the cabin had a different quality now than it had 6 months ago. He couldn't name it exactly. It was like a door that had finally settled flush in its frame, not heavy, just right. He still didn't fully understand why he had opened the door that first morning, but he was beginning to think it didn't matter why. Some things just needed doing. He closed his eyes and slept, and for the first time in several years, he did not dream of snow or iron or the ridge at Colvar. The night Carpenter mentioned broken things, it had been raining since midday. The kind of rain the Vale sometimes got in late summer, a slow, deliberate soak that turned the red soil dark and filled the irrigation furrows without being asked. The children were asleep. The cabin was close and warm. Adrien was sharpening a chisel at the table, and Carpenter was working a strip of hide from an old saddle into something with a purpose he hadn't asked about. She broke the quiet without preamble. "This leather," she said, holding the strip up. "It cracked down the center. Most people would throw it away." He watched her hands work. She was overlapping the split edges and drawing a heavy sinew thread through them, pulling the join tight with practiced pressure. "Some things can't be fixed," he said. He hadn't meant it about leather. She looked at him. Her eyes moved briefly to his scar, then back to his face. "Things that are broken can still hold together," she said, "if you bind them with the right pressure." Adrien said nothing for a moment. The rain moved across the roof in waves. The fire settled low. "You ever regret leaving the clan camps?" he said finally. "I regret nothing that kept my children alive," she said without hesitation, then quieter, "but I carry it." He understood that precisely, the difference between regret and the weight of choices made. He set the chisel down. He went to the bunk and crouched and pulled out the flat wooden box from underneath, the one he hadn't opened in 3 years. He placed it on the table and sat with it closed for a moment before lifting the lid. Inside were 5 silver campaign medals on faded ribbons, a folded piece of parchment with an iron frontier crest, and a short knife with a blade worn thin from sharpening. He looked at them the way you look at something you've almost forgotten how to feel about. "The medals," Carpenter said, studying them. "You earned them?" "I was given them," he said. "That's not exactly the same thing." She picked up the smallest medal and turned it over. The engraving on the back read, "Colvar Ridge, 3rd Campaign." She set it down with care. Neither of them said anything about what that campaign had done to her family. The knowledge sat between them, visible and acknowledged, and somehow that was better than pretending. "You keep them," she said at last. "I don't know why," he admitted. "Because you haven't decided yet what they mean," she said. "That is not weakness. That is the work still being done." He closed the box, slid it back under the bunk. When he straightened up and looked at her, she had already returned to the hide strip, her hands moving steady and sure. He sat back down at the table and picked up the chisel and resumed sharpening. The rain continued. The silence that followed felt less empty than before. The wagon came from Goldport on a Tuesday, moving fast for its load. Adrien heard it before he saw it, the irregular hammer of wheels on rutted ground and the tight, breathless calls of a man pushing a horse harder than the road warranted. He set down the saw he was using on the porch repair and moved to the edge of the yard. Caleb Marsh, the ironsmith from Goldport, pulled the wagon to a stop in a spray of red dust. He was a wide man, grey-bearded, with hands like splitting mauls, and a face that Adrian had always found straightforward and reliable. Today that face was grey under the beard, and stripped of everything except fear. "Pike," he said, already down from the wagon. "It's my boy. Fever's in the chest. The doctor in town says he can't break it." In the wagon bed, wrapped in every blanket the man owned, was a child of perhaps 10. His breathing was audible from where Adrian stood, wet and grinding, like a saw working through green wood. Adrian stepped toward the wagon but stopped when Crevena came around the corner of the cabin. She moved past him without a word and climbed into the wagon bed and put her hand on the child's chest. She closed her eyes. Her lips moved, very quietly, in her own language. Then she climbed back out. "I need the mortar and the stone pestle," she told Adrian, "and the dried pine resin from the green tin in the shed." He got them. She ground a combination of herbs from her pack, added the pine resin, mixed it with water from the rain barrel, and heated the result in a shallow pan over the fire. The smell that rose from it was sharp and medicinal, something like eucalyptus and earth. She applied the warm compress to the child's chest, wrapped it, and made him drink a smaller amount of the liquid preparation. Then she sat in the wagon bed and waited. Caleb stood in the yard with his hat in his hands. Adrian stood beside him and said nothing. Tyon and Noah watched from the cabin steps, with expressions that suggested they had seen their mother do this before. By the following morning, the child's breathing had eased. By noon, the fever had broken and the boy was asking for food. Caleb stood at the tailgate of the wagon with his eyes full and his voice out of use. Crevena accepted no payment. She asked only that the boy drink the preparation twice more over the following week and stay out of the cold. As Caleb's wagon turned back toward Goldport, he called from the seat, "People in town have been saying things, Pike, about who you've got staying with you." "People in town always are," Adrian said. "What I saw today," Caleb said, "I'll be saying something different now." He drove away. The dust settled. Adrian looked at Crevena. She was watching the wagon go, arms crossed over her chest, face unreadable. "That's going to change things," he said. "Good things or bad things?" she asked. "Both, probably," he said honestly. She nodded slowly, as though she had expected nothing different. The merchants wouldn't buy his planks. He found out on the third trip into Goldport, after Crevena had been with him in the Vale for 2 months. He had a load of good walnut boards, straight-grained and clean, the kind of lumber that should have sold itself. The buyer at the trading post looked at them, looked at Adrian, and named a price so low it was an insult wearing numbers for clothes. When Adrian pushed back, the man shrugged and said he had heard things. About the situation at Pike's place, about who was living there, and what that meant for the kind of man Pike apparently was. Adrian stood in the trading post for a moment, very still, the way he used to go, still before things became unrecoverable. Then he loaded his boards back onto the wagon and drove home. He was quiet all evening. Crevena watched him across the table and did not ask him anything until the children were asleep. Then she said, "Tell me." He told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her thumbnail tracing a pattern on the table grain. "You chose to be decent in a world that punishes decency," she said. "That is harder than any battlefield." "It's not what I chose," he said. "I just didn't choose differently." "That is the same thing," she said flatly. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. "I'm not afraid of losing the business. I've lived on less." He paused. "I'm angry that it costs something. Being decent, it shouldn't cost anything." "It always cost," she said. "The question is whether what you pay for it is worth more than what you keep." He looked at her. She was watching him with calm, level eyes, no pity in them, which he appreciated more than he could easily say. "Your people," he said. "Did they always pay this kind of price?" She set her hands flat on the table. "My people have paid this price for as long as there have been iron frontier soldiers and land deeds," she said quietly. "We are still here." He absorbed that. "You should know," she said, "that Caleb Marsh has been speaking in the market square about his son, about what happened here." Adrian hadn't known that. He filed it under things he wasn't sure how to feel about. "Let him," he said. "I can't control what people say." "No," she agreed, "but you can control what you do when they say it. And so far, you have done well." He didn't know whether she meant it as comfort or assessment. He suspected it was both. Coming from her, he decided that was enough. The news from the Northern Marks arrived folded inside a leather courier packet, delivered by a rider who didn't get down from his horse. Adrian took it inside. He read it once, then set it on the table. He sat with it for a while before calling Carpenter in from the garden. She read it standing up, which was how he knew it was bad. People who are bracing for impact tend to keep their feet. The dispatch was a standard colonial clearance notice from the Iron Frontier Administration. It listed the settlements and campsites that had been resolved in the Southern Hill campaigns over the past summer season. The language was administrative and flat and terrible. It described relocations to labor districts, camp disbandments, census reductions. Among the named sites was Grakchovara, the seasonal camp of the Tescan Hill clan. Kravena's people. The ones she had told herself had gone far enough south. The ones she had held in her chest as a quiet hope across every morning for the past months. She lowered the paper. She looked at the table. Then, very quietly, she sat down on the floor, which was not the kind of thing she ever did, and she made a sound that Adrian had no framework for, not a scream, but something older and deeper than screaming. It came from her chest and it filled the cabin, and then it stopped, and the silence after it was worse. "I left them," she said. The words were barely sound. "I was here planting, I was here mending, while they... Carpenter. I left them." She pressed her arms around her own ribs, holding herself together the way a person does when the alternative is coming apart. Adrian crouched down in front of her. He didn't have anything useful to say, and he knew it, so he didn't try. He had learned in 38 years that useless words spoken into grief were a kind of theft. He just stayed down there, close enough that she could feel that he was present, and he waited. Outside, Tyon and Noah were in the garden. He could hear them, faint and ordinary, the sound of them going about the afternoon as it was, unaware. After a long while, the shaking in her hands slowed. "You didn't leave them," he said then carefully. "You chose to keep them alive." He gestured barely toward the garden. "You kept those two alive. That's not abandonment. That's what people do when they're the only wall standing." She looked at him. Her eyes were red-edged and hollow. "That doesn't make it feel like less." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She closed her eyes. He stayed where he was. The light moved across the cabin floor, slow and unhurried, the way light does when it has no opinion about what is happening beneath it. Eventually, Carpenter pressed both palms to the floor and stood. She smoothed her leather skirt. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden where her children moved between the rows. "They're still alive," she said to herself as much as him. "Yes," he said. She turned around. Her face had gone through a furnace and come out the other side. Not harder, but denser. "Then we continue," she said. He nodded. She went back outside. He watched her walk to the garden and say something to the children, something calm and small. Tyon looked up at her face and then pressed close to her side. She put a hand on his head, and they stayed like that, the three of them, among the green rows. Adrian stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then his eyes dropped to the river below, catching the last angle of afternoon sun. There it was again, that same sharp glint along the water's edge, there and gone in a breath. He stared at it this time, long enough to understand it. The crystal on Crevena's wrist, the sinew cord she always wore. It had caught the light the same way that first morning when she stepped out of the shadows, and he had not yet known what to make of her. He hadn't seen a sign or a warning. He had seen her, and not known it yet. He let out a slow breath. Then he turned back to the garden and went to help with the rose. The afternoon went on.